Hello and welcome back to the Combat tutorial series. So far we have looked at how combat works in EU4, what do the combat modifiers mean, and some in-depth look into unit pips, general pips, and siege mechanics. If you have already seen and understood part 1 and part 2, good for you. Now you understand all about EU4 combat system. Except you might still be wondering, what is a good army composition? How many infantry, cavalry should I have at the start of game? When should I start building more artillery? Army composition is really what matters and what the previous parts have been building up to. Because the current army composition will win you battles without breaking your economy, and to understand what could be a good army composition, you need to understand the combat basics first. At this point, I'll assume you all know the basics of combat and the combat modifiers in game. So we'll go ahead and start exploring the question of an ideal army composition. And just like everything else in EU4, the answer is fairly complex. There are a lot of posts on Reddit and Paradox forums suggesting different army comps, but the question really is that early game, how much cavalry and infantry do you need, and later in game, how much artillery should you have in the army stack? And is cavalry worth it late game? So let's talk about cavalry and infantry to start. I'm sure most of you have watched Arumba's video on why cavalry is bad, and if you haven't yet, I'll leave a link in description to that video. He makes some very good points and I agree with him for the most part. I think cavalry is very overutilized by newer players. And to explain why that is the case, let's look at the key differences between infantry and cavalry units. If we start at the recruitment window, we will see that cavalry costs more than infantry. In fact, 2.5 times more for both recruitment and maintenance. That is a significant price difference, and the whole argument that the cavalry isn't good enough comes down to this. The cost-benefit calculations do not favor cavalry. That's just saying that if cavalry is 2.5 times more expensive than infantry, it should do 2.5 times more damage in a battle in one way or another. But that is not the case. So let's look at the military screen next. We start with these modifiers to infantry and cavalry shock and fire damage. To simplify the comparison between infantry and cavalry, we will just add fire and shock damage modifiers together to get the total modifier from that unit type. The actual calculation will be slightly different, but it's close enough and this is just easier to follow. So, we start at military tech 3, where infantry fire is plus 0.35, infantry shock is plus 0.5, cavalry fire is 0, and cavalry shock is plus 1. So infantry has plus 0.85 damage modifier in total, and cavalry has plus 1 damage modifier. Clearly, cav will do more damage. But it isn't giving us 2.5 times more damage compared to infantry. So the cost-benefit calculation favors infantry by a big margin here. The other big difference between infantry and cavalry is the flanking range, which is not shown here clearly. We briefly touched on it in part 1 of the tutorial series. Basically, infantry has a flanking range of 1, which means a unit of infantry can attack the unit in front of it and 1 unit on each side. Cavalry has a flanking range of 2 at the start, which means a unit of cavalry can attack the unit in front of it and 2 units on each side. The important thing to note here, and this is frequently misunderstood by newer players, is that flanking range of 2 does not mean that cavalry will attack 5 units at a time. 1 unit will only do damage to 1 enemy unit at a time, and which unit gets attacked is calculated automatically by game. I think the units will attack the unit directly in front by default, but might switch if there is no unit in front, or if adjacent units become weaker, or if enemy artillery appears in the first row. Flanking range is something that could make cavalry very powerful, but unit deployment in game, which is also automatically calculated, is not the best. Let's take an example here. At the start of game, we have a combat width of 20. So say we fill the combat width with 16 infantry and 4 cavalry. Now say we are fighting an enemy with an army of 14 infantry and 2 cavalry. If you look at the flanking range here, this infantry can engage one of these 3 units. This infantry can engage these 2 units. This enemy cavalry can engage one of these 5 units. Our cavalry here can engage these 2 units, and the other cavalry can only engage this 1 unit. So during the battle, this enemy cavalry will take damage from both our cavs, this infantry, and maybe even this infantry. So there's a good chance that cavalry will go down sooner. Let's say that happens pretty early in battle in the first few days. Now this cavalry will start attacking this enemy infantry, but our other cavalry now cannot attack anyone, and it will just sit there for rest of the battle basically. The ideal unit deployment would be that the cavalry always stays in the outermost flanking range of the enemy army units, but that's not how unit deployment works in EU4. I mean, yes, because of the extra flanking range of that cavalry, we were able to take down enemy cavalry sooner, probably, but after that, our cavalry is completely useless in the battle. So, is having a unit that's 250% more expensive worth it to get that initial damage done? It's hard to calculate the exact numbers on this question, but I would argue that no. It's very unlikely that cavalry will give us a return of 250% in a battle. Now take a scenario where the enemy has a full combat width 2. In this case, the usefulness of flanking range decreases even further, making cavalry even less useful. The third big difference between infantry and cavalry are the unit pips. For Western tech group nations, starting infantry has 2 total pips, while starting cavalry has 3 total pips, which is a sizable difference. This difference in pips will vary from tech to tech, but by late game, infantry will have more pips than cavalry. So as military tech progresses, the unit pips change, and you can find the full list on EU4 wiki. I'll leave a link to that in description. With military tech, the fire and shock damage modifiers also increase, and cavalry will have a slight edge over infantry there until very late game. Flanking range also increases with tech. As we saw, cavalry has a starting flanking range of 2, and it becomes 3 at military tech 18, which is fairly late. Flanking range is actually increased by 25% at Tech 10 as well, but that just means that it goes from 2 to 2.5, and the way game calculations are done, it's rounded down to 2. The 25% flanking range helps with regiments that aren't full strength though, as flanking range also decreases with lower regiment strength. So we have talked about the difference between infantry and cavalry units, and we saw largely that cavalry units are better in combat, but they don't really justify the expensive price tag. And if you didn't follow those arguments or don't agree with them for some reason, here is an easy one. If we have 100 ducats, we can recruit 10 infantry units, or 5 infantry units and 2 cavalry units. Now you can run simulations on that all day long, and the 10 infantry army will win that fight. To be clear, I'm not saying that cavalry is trash. In my opinion, cavalry is very situational. For example, most nations start with some cavs. I think it's prudent to keep them around for a few years, as we did not pay the upfront cost for those units. Cavalry are very useful. If you have a small force limit, then you can get more cavs and get more damage output for the same number of troops. Cavalry are also extremely powerful for certain nations that get cavalry bonuses, such as Poland. You can get somewhere around 70% cav compatibility, which is obviously huge, and you should have more cavs in your army then. Or say you're playing as a steppe nomad and you want to fight Ming. The tech group difference means your cavalry will have more pips than their units early game, and you also get more bonuses to cavalry damage. So cavalry definitely has some uses, but it's not worth building in every game. In my games, I usually ditch all cavalry by around Tech 10. Late game, cavalry is completely useless except in case of Poland because of bonuses to cavalry compatibility. Next, let's look at artillery. You can first recruit artillery units at military tech 7. At this point, my army is composed of whatever cavalry I started with, maximum number of infantry I can afford, and 1 artillery. The only job of this artillery in early game is to help with sieges. Once I hit tech level 16, I start to fill out the backline with artillery. They are fairly expensive, so it might not happen straight away, but at tech 16 you have a combat width of 30, so you should start aiming for that number of artillery. Having 10 artillery in your army is a good milestone too, as it maximizes the siege bonus on level 2 forts. The reason you wait till tech 16 is that artillery gets a big bump in fire and shock damage modifiers then, and also the economy gets a little stronger by then, which means you can afford more artillery. Couple of interesting things to note about artillery though. They are the only units that can deal damage from the back row, although they only do 50% damage from the back row. So why don't we put them in the front row where they can deal full damage? Well, they also take 50% more damage if they are in the front row, which means they will get decimated there. In most cases, if your artillery is fighting from the front row, there's a good chance you have already lost the battle. Artillery also gives half of its defensive pips to the unit directly in front of it, but this is only relevant later in game when artillery units have 2 or more defensive pips, as the game will calculate half of 1 pip to 0.5 and round it down to 0 for calculations. So late game, you should have stacks with full row of artillery, that's the max combat width of 40, and to cover all 40 artillery you need at least 40 infantry in the first row. But during battle, some infantry units might die, and that will mean artillery moving to the front row instead, which is a recipe for a quick loss. So what I like to do is have stacks of 50 infantry and 40 artillery late game. This huge 90 army stack in one province means a lot of attrition though, so you can just keep them divided into 2 when marching around and group them together before engaging enemy army. Well, actually by that time, I don't really care about attrition that much because that's too much microing for my taste, and also because all my infantry is mercenary infantry by that time. If you followed my Aragon playthrough series, you will know that I like having mercenaries pretty early on in game, and I understand some players don't do that. I think mercenaries in EU4 is a broken mechanic, and you should abuse it as much as you can, but that's probably a topic for whole another video. So to summarize army compositions, the early composition will depend on whether you have some cavalry compatibility bonuses. If you don't have those, ditch your cavalry around tech 10, get 1 artillery at tech 7, and by late game you should have a full back row of artillery and all infantry in front, preferably mercs. You should never have any cavalry late game unless it's a cavalry focused nation. The other small topic I wanted to cover in this part is army professionalism. It's a game mechanic that is included in the Cradle of Civilization DLC. It gives some very powerful modifiers such as plus 10% damage to fire and shock and plus 20% siege ability, which is huge. These modifiers scale from 0 to 100 army professionalism. You also get some bonuses at certain army professionalism levels. The most important one is at 100% army professionalism, which is 50% cost for recruiting generals, making re-rolling generals really cheap. Army professionalism is increased by drilling armies and by recruiting generals, and it decreases by hiring mercs and if you slacken standards, which I personally think is worth doing. For 5% army professionalism, you get 2 years worth of manpower, and manpower in this game is a very important resource. There are a lot of events where you can buy army professionalism for a large sum of money as well. Drilling armies is something I don't usually do in my games, but drilling does give some good bonuses to the army. I don't do it often enough because I'm at war fairly constantly, it's just how I play, and also because you lose the drill bonus very quickly. There is a passive loss if you're not drilling. Then you also lose the drill bonuses if your units take any attrition or damage during the battle, so any army reinforcement will decrease the drill status of that unit, and then it takes so long to build it back up again. So in my opinion, on paper drilling is a very powerful mechanic, but I'm not sure it's practically applicable in every game. Of course, if you are at peace and you can keep your army maintenance up, you should definitely use drilling. I think drilling mechanic could use a slight buff in game at some point. What do you guys think about drilling and army professionalism? And this is a good point to stop for part 3 of the combat tutorial series. I want to dedicate the next part to naval combat as it differs from land combat significantly that we have been discussing so far. I'm not sure when part 4 will come out, but hopefully it'll be soon. Let me know what you guys think of the tutorial series so far, and if there's any other combat based mechanic that I have missed out on that you would like me to cover. As always, thank you for your time. You were watching a Radio Guide, and I'll see you all in the next one.